Hello, and welcome to our AP Chemistry review of topic 5.5, collision model. The collision model is a model that allows us to figure out whether a reaction will occur or not, or how reactions occur in the first place. The collision model says that two things have to occur in order for a collision to result in a reaction. The first is that reactants have to collide with sufficient energy for bonds to break and new bonds to form. So there must be the required activation energy for the reaction to occur. The second part of the collision model says that the reactants must be oriented in the correct manner in order for an effective collision to occur. So we're going to look at these two different parts of the collision model individually. The first part that we talked about was energy. Do the collisions have sufficient energy to overcome the activation energy? If you remember, when we talk about an energy diagram, we have reaction progress on the x-axis and we have energy on the y-axis. And in order for a reaction to occur, you have to overcome the activation energy. And so I've drawn an exothermic reaction here, and the activation energy that we've talked about in the past is the energy required for the reaction to occur. And this energy produces a activated complex or a transition state, which then can become the products. What's really happening here in this activation energy is breaking bonds. We have to break the bonds in the reactants in order for the new bonds to form to make the products. Whether the reactants will get over the activation energy is temperature dependent. So in order for reactants to collide into each other with sufficient energy, they have to be at an appropriate temperature that allows them to collide with that energy to overcome the activation energy. One way we can represent this, the number of particles that have the energy sufficient to do this, is what's called a Maxwell-Boltzmann diagram. And a Maxwell-Boltzmann diagram or distribution simply shows the distribution of particles at a given temperature and how much kinetic energy they have. So this would be percentage of particles on a Maxwell distribution diagram. And this would be energy on the x-axis. So at any given temperature, particles will have all kinds of different energies, because remember, temperature is the average kinetic energy of the particles. So the maximum pump here would be basically the energy corresponding to the temperature that these particles are at. Some particles will have less energy, some particles will have more energy. At some point, we have the energy needed for the particles to actually react with one another, the activation energy. And so at any given temperature, there's going to be a certain number of particles that do have the amount of energy required to react. And so a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution simply allows you to see what percentage of the particles in a given sample at a given temperature would have the energy required to overcome the activation energy. So even though the average temperature may not be high enough for all the particles to react, some of the particles will have an average kinetic energy that is capable of getting over that activation energy. And again, that is simply part of the collision model that says that particles have to collide with sufficient energy to overcome that activation energy in order to react. The second thing we talked about was orientation. And I've given you a little diagram over here on the right-hand side to show you how orientation works. Let's say that you had a reaction between nitrogen monoxide and ozone, O3. And when those collide correctly, we will produce nitrogen dioxide and oxygen if the reaction actually occurs effectively. So what is an ineffective collision? Well, molecules have to collide with the correct orientation for bonds to break and new bonds to form. So if our nitrogen monoxide molecule collides with the ozone molecule ineffectively, in other words, the orientation is not correct, then they're just going to bounce off each other and we'll still have nitrogen monoxide and ozone. An effective collision means that the molecules collide in a way that the bonds will break and new bonds will form. So in this animation that I have here, or this cartoon that I have here, this is the correct orientation that the nitrogen monoxide and the ozone have to collide with one another in order to be effective. When they collide, the bond can actually break in the ozone molecule. One of the oxygen atoms can break off and bond to the nitrogen monoxide molecule to make a nitrogen dioxide molecule, and then O2 remains. And so orientation just means that the molecules collide with one another in the correct arrangement that they can form the products. So two things that go into the collision model for an effective reaction. One is, do they have sufficient energy to react? And two, do they have the correct orientation to react? Also, because these two things affect how a reaction occurs, it affects the rate of the reaction. So if you have a lot of molecules that do not have enough energy to react, then you're going to have a slow reaction. If you have a whole bunch of molecules that aren't oriented correctly in their collisions, then you're going to have a slow reaction. If orientation is a pretty easy thing for molecules to attain, then you'll have a fast reaction. If you have high temperatures so that more molecules have the sufficient energy to collide and react, then you will have a fast reaction. So the collision model explains how the kinetics of a reaction occurs also. Hopefully this helped remind you about what the collision model says about chemical reactions. If you have any questions, please let me know.